the death penalty for murder. Here, the gulf is unbridgeable between those of us who believe that some murderers, and I emphasize some murderers, should be put to death, and those who believe that no murderer should ever be put to death.
I find it odd that anybody who describes themselves as pro-life like Denny Prager does, and he does, could possibly be for the death penalty. And yet...
I am in favor of the death penalty because I am pro-life.
Let's do this.
BionicDance!
Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. I wonder sometimes whether religious people would be more in favor of the death penalty or less if they didn't believe in an afterlife. I've never seen anybody straight up ask them that. But I think the real question here is about the nature of justice and what our justice system exists to do.
Take this example.
No, let's not. What he's about to do is to describe a particularly brutal murder, complete with ominous background ambient sound effects. If you really want to hear it, the video to which I'm responding is linked in the description as always. The reason I'm cutting it out is because the intent is obviously to tug at your heartstrings, to argue from emotion. But just because some crimes are pretty nasty, that doesn't give us license to be nasty in return.
So, is there anything a person can do to deserve the death penalty?
The only time the death penalty is ever warranted is for the crime of being William Shatner.
In fact, many opponents of capital punishment believe that killing murderers is the same as murder. You heard me right. Most opponents equate the murder of an innocent family with putting the murderers of that family to death.
No, they don't. Nobody is saying that. Nobody is comparing how nasty one killing is to another. Well, except you. But you are advocating the killing of a human being for reasons other than self-defense against mortal danger. It's a premeditated killing, and the only factor that distinguishes it from murder is that it's legal. If you don't believe me, look it up.
Opponents of capital punishment also argue that keeping all murderers alive sanctifies the value of human life. But the opposite is true. Keeping every murderer alive cheapens human life because it belittles murder. That's easily proven.
Leaving aside the fact that proved is more grammatically correct in this context than proven, what you're about to hear is one of the most absurd arguments ever, so strap in.
Imagine that the punishment for murder were the same as the punishment for driving over the speed limit. Wouldn't that belittle murder and thereby cheapen human life? Of course it would. Society teaches how bad an action is by the punishment it metes out.
Sure, that's true. But if the punishment for murder and speeding were the same, it might not cheapen murder at all. If the punishment were the death penalty for both, it would overly vilify driving too fast. But ask yourself what punishment is even for. Why do we punish people for their misdeeds? If you threaten a child with punishment for hitting another child, I would hope that what you're doing is trying to encourage good behavior over bad by showing that the consequences for misbehavior come at a price high enough that the crime isn't worth committing. If they decide to hit the other kid, do you hit the child as punishment? Or are they grounded, revoke their TV privileges, or paddle their behind? Yes, we punish proportionally based on the severity of the offense, but just because the punishment fits the crime, that doesn't mean it has to resemble the crime. Ask yourself whether you're after justice and good behavior, or if your goal is actually revenge.
And what about opponents' argument that an innocent person may be executed? This argument may be sincerely held, but it's not honest. Why? Because opponents of capital punishment oppose the death penalty even when there is absolute proof of the murderer's guilt.
And that's because it's one of many objections. It's a bullet point, not the entire argument. The objection to the death penalty is not whether murderers are punished, but rather the nature of the punishment. Killing someone is rather permanent and can't really be undone. Not that someone being on death row for decades before being exonerated can give them back their lost years, but at least they're not dead.
Moreover, by keeping every murderer alive, many more people are murdered. Other prisoners, guards, and people outside of prison in case of escape or early release, than the infinitesimally small number of people who might be wrongly executed.
Infinitesimally small, he says. According to a study, that infinitesimal number is 1 in 25. In 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney was sent to the electric chair for murder after a complete sham of a trial. His conviction was posthumously overturned in 2014. Denny here is saying that these innocent lives, people wrongfully killed at the hands of the government, is a price worth paying in order to end the lives of murderers, and this somehow sanctifies life. He apparently sees no problem with that. I say that infinitesimal or not, I don't want innocent blood on my hands. I'm not sure I want any blood on my hands. I'd like to think I'm better than a killer. But Prager the bloodthirsty here seems quite eager to set up the headsman's block now, doesn't he?
And now with DNA testing and other advanced forensic tools, it is virtually impossible to execute an innocent person.
This assumes that all actors in the case are honest and unbiased. It assumes that all testing that can be done will be done. It assumes there will be no racial prejudice, that there will be no tampering with or suppression of evidence. In a perfect world, the justice system will never make a mistake or render unfair judgments. But if there is anything that this world isn't, perfect tops that list.
Do you really believe that the torturers, rapists, murderers of Dr. William Pettit's wife and daughters, and evil men like them, deserve to keep their lives? If you're like most people, your answer is no.
While it's true that a majority favor the death penalty, it's not like it's a huge landslide. It's pretty much in the center with a slight lean toward favoring the death penalty. Though, if you look at the Pew Research data, you'll find a few funny trends. Those who most support the death penalty tend to be white, male, Republican, old, and religious, while those who oppose it tend to be minorities, young, female, educated, and Democrat. So basically, if you're an overprivileged elderly white god-botherer with a dick, chances are pretty good you'll favor executing people. Now, why do you suppose that might be?
Your heart, your mind, your whole being cries out for some justice and fairness in this world.
But not at the cost of being able to look at myself in the mirror. I like the idea of justice. I like the idea of fairness. And I'm also realistic enough to know that I won't always get either one, and that I won't always agree with everybody what is just or fair. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a kid at heart, but I gave up the child's cry of "it's not fair" a long time ago. To realize I'm actually more mature than Dennis Prager is disturbing on multiple levels.
But if you really do believe these people deserve to keep their lives, well, as I said at the outset, I don't understand you.
And I presume don't want to. But the question isn't whether they deserve to keep their lives, unless you see the justice system as some form of revenge. The question is about what the purpose of the justice system is in the first place. Why would we decide to execute somebody rather than some other method of punishment? Do we hold their fate up as a way to deter future murderers? The scientific consensus seems to be that if capital punishment deters crime, there's no evidence of it one way or the other. One study showed that criminals are far more worried about getting caught than with what will happen to them if they are. Obviously, the purpose of execution is not rehabilitation. So the only realistic possibilities for the purpose of capital punishment is either revenge or just to keep these people off the streets. If I wanted revenge, I honestly can't think of a fate worse than telling someone they're going to die in prison, that their next several decades will be nothing but gray bars and other criminals. Never again will they go on a date, watch their favorite movies, go on vacation, eat a good meal, or any of the other things that make life great. It sounds like an absolutely hellish existence, and knowing that it'll only end with death, that terrifies me. Knowing that my life is over without being over, if I were handed that fate, I'd demand execution, frankly. So if I wanted a criminal who wronged me to pay for their misdeeds, life without parole would be far better revenge than death, at least for my tastes. I cannot be on board with capital punishment. We shouldn't be killers. We're better than that. Okay, before I go, a few thank yous. I'm planning on finally getting some transport now that I can legally drive again thanks to my head meats being fixed. I've been taking a motorcycle safety course and I'm probably gonna get like a big ass scooter, probably a Honda Reflex or Honda Silverwing. They're highway capable, have lots of storage, and they look really cool, so they're perfect. And you better believe I'm gonna decorate the darn thing. I already have a companion cube decal and a Zopdaz decal. Well, one of you sent me, from my Amazon wishlist, a Last Starfighter decal. Darn it, there was no note with it, so I don't know who to thank. I wish I could, I'm sorry. Also, Moldred has sent me this. It's called Chalky. It's the basis for something that I saw on Nickelodeon a long time ago where a kid's imaginary friend is actually an alien. It creeped me right the heck out when I first saw it, and then I watched it again recently, and it wasn't quite as creepy as I've remembered, but still, I wanted to read the book it was based on, so here it is. Again, thank you to Moldred for that. And until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think. It's a premeditated killing, and the only factor It's a premeditated killing, and the only why can't I say factor? Not that someone being on death row for decades before being exonerated can give them their blah. Ugh. If I wanted revenge, I honestly can't think of a fate.
So, who wants cake? You have to rate first.